The first thing Lyudmila Pavlichenko noticed was not the microphones or the bright studio lamps. It was the curtain. Thin, beige, hanging between her and the stage of an American radio auditorium in Washington, D.C., on an evening in October 1942. She sat on a simple wooden chair behind it, in close enough to hear the murmur of the audience, but out of sight, as if she were a prop to be revealed at the appropriate moment. In Sevastopol, she had crouched behind broken stone. Here, in the capital of a distant ally, she was concealed by fabric. A young American assistant in a neat suit hovered nearby, shuffling papers. From time to time he glanced nervously at Lyudmila, then at the curtain, as if checking that both remained in position. On his clipboard she could read, upside down, a few typed lines in English. The words were simple enough for her to follow. Lyudmila Pavlichenko, Soviet girl sniper, avoid graphic details. Emphasize courage, youth, femininity. No exact number of kills. She focused on the last line. No exact number. Somewhere between the ruins of Sevastopol and this carefully lit studio, the figure that had followed her like a shadow had become impolite to mention. 309. Lyudmila Pavlichenko folded her hands in her lap and listened. Through the curtain she heard the host warming up the crowd with a practiced tone. He spoke about bravery, Allied unity, our charming guest from Russia. An older American woman, a coordinator of some sort, leaned in toward her. Miss Pavlichenko, she said slowly, when you go out, we want people to see hope, not scars. Do you understand? Lyudmila held her gaze. I understand English, she replied. Hope is not what I saw in Sevastopol. The woman hesitated, then produced a small, professional smile. Just remember, she continued, you're an inspiration. People here don't need all the unpleasant details. Unpleasant details. The sound when a shot lands correctly. The weight of a rifle after 10 hours in the same position. None of that fit behind an American curtain. She adjusted the collar of her plain, dark dress, the closest thing to civilian clothing she owned. The metal at her chest felt heavy under the fabric. In Odessa and Sevastopol, her world had been simple. A tunic, a rifle, a line of rubble that separated life from death. Here, everything was layered, curtains, script, smiles. Through the fabric, the audience laughed at something the host had said. The assistant checked his watch. Lyudmila Pavlichenko straightened her back, not from pride, but from habit. A sniper spends hours motionless. Posture becomes discipline, not vanity. She listened as her name was introduced with theatrical emphasis, wrapped in adjectives she would never have chosen for herself. The young lady from the Soviet Union. A symbol of resistance. Our beautiful guest, Lyudmila Pavlichenko. The assistant touched the edge of the curtain as if about to draw it aside, then paused. He turned to her one last time. Remember, he said quietly, no numbers. Talk about courage, about friendship between nations. The crowd applauded. Lyudmila looked enough that she could see vague shapes beyond it. She understood the situation with the same clarity with which she once gauged distance and wind. They had brought her across an ocean not to hear what she had done, but to decide which parts of it could be shown. They were not just hiding Lyudmila Pavlichenko behind curtains. They were hiding the war. Long before Lyudmila Pavlichenko sat behind an American curtain, she had stood in a very different place. The blasted hillsides above Sevastopol, where every stone held heat from exploding shells and every shadow could hide a German helmet. It was there, amid smoke, dust and the sharp smell of cordite, that her reputation had taken form. Not in newspapers, not in speeches, but in the precise geometry of a sniper's work. She had not begun as a symbol. She had begun as a history student who wanted to serve. When the Germans invaded, Pavlichenko volunteered immediately. The recruiter looked her up and down and suggested the nurses' corps. She responded by placing a sharpshooter's badge on the table. Within weeks, she was on the southern front, a Mosin Nagant rifle pressed against her cheek, counting breaths between shots. By the summer of 1942, Lyudmila Pavlichenko had become something the Soviet Union desperately needed. Cities were falling, villages were erased, millions were dead. The Red Army needed heroes, figures who could prove that the USSR was not collapsing under the weight of the Wehrmacht. Her tally climbed, 20, then 50, then 100. The reports traveled faster than she did. They labeled her Lady Death, a nickname she disliked for its theatricality but could not escape. When a sniper logs kill after kill in urban ruins, discipline becomes identity. She walked the edges of trenches like someone balancing between life and disappearance. She learned to estimate wind by the motion of torn cloth hanging from shattered windows. She taught younger snipers how to move through rubble without dislodging dust. Everything was practical, nothing symbolic. The symbolism came later, crafted not by her, but around her. In Moscow, officials examined the growing casualty lists and understood that military victories alone would not secure help from the United States. Lend-lease materials were flowing, yes, but with caution, with slow bureaucracy. The Soviet Union needed more. They needed tanks, planes, ammunition, trucks, supplies measured in thousands of tons, not batches of crates. And so the party looked for a representative who could travel abroad, someone who could stand before foreign crowds and embody Soviet resilience. A general would be political. A minister would be dull. A propagandist would be obvious. But a young woman with 309 confirmed kills, that was irresistible. Lyudmila Pavlichenko was informed, not asked, that she would be withdrawn from the front. Her commanders insisted the order came from the highest levels. She was wounded at the time, recovering from a mortar blast, and physically unable to argue. When she regained her strength, she found herself not headed back to the craters of Sevastopol, but toward meetings, interviews, and carefully supervised travel. Her uniform was cleaned. Her medals were polished. A new tunic was fitted. Photographs were staged. Officials crafted phrases for her. Strength of Soviet womanhood, unyielding defender, hero of the people. She was instructed to smile more, to speak less, to stand as an emblem rather than a soldier. On the surface, the assignment sounded noble. She would be the face of Soviet courage, appealing to the American public, showing them the reality of the Eastern Front. But when Lyudmila Pavlichenko boarded the aircraft that carried her toward Tehran, Cairo, and eventually Washington, she sensed the truth. She was no longer being treated as a sniper. She was becoming an artifact, a symbol that Stalin could deploy across oceans. A weapon shaped not of metal, but of narrative. And as the American coast came into view for the first time, Lyudmila understood that she was flying toward a world that did not know war the way she did, and one that would try in its own way to reshape her. When Lyudmila Pavlichenko stepped onto American soil, the first thing she noticed was the quiet. Not the absence of gunfire kind of quiet. She had learned long ago that silence on the front was only the space between bombardments, but a different species of quiet entirely. A quiet polished by distance, by safety, by comfort. A quiet that had no memory of rubble or smoke. Her arrival generated immediate interest. Reporters crowded the docks, notebooks ready, cameras lifted. At first, she assumed they would ask about Sevastopol, the siege, the snipers she had trained, the months of attritional bloodletting along the cliffs. But the first question came from a smiling young man with a fedora tilted back on his head. "Miss Pavlichenko," he said brightly, "what lipstick do you wear at the front?" Lyudmila stared at him, certain she had misheard. "I do not wear lipstick in battle," she answered flatly. The reporters laughed, not cruelly, but nervously, as though unsure how to process her seriousness. Another leaned forward. "And how do you keep your hair so neat in combat?" Her hair had been matted with dust and sweat for months. She had cut it herself with a bayonet at one point. She simply replied, "War keeps it neat." The coordinators shepherding the event exchanged glances. One whispered, "Let's keep the tone light." The phrase lodged itself in her mind like shrapnel. War is not light, she thought. War is weight. In Chicago, a photographer asked her to pose holding a rifle, but please, dear, not in such a threatening way. They handed her the weapon as if it were a parasol. She refused to hold it incorrectly. The photographer sighed. Another request came in New York. Could she sit by a window for a soft portrait, her medals catching the afternoon sun? Could she smile just a little so the public wouldn't be intimidated? Could she turn her head slightly so the scar near her jaw wasn't visible? Each request was small, harmless, polite. But they collected around Lyudmila Pavlichenko like thin, invisible wires, each one pulling her a degree away from what she truly was. At a luncheon, organized by well-meaning American socialites, someone asked whether Soviet women missed wearing dresses, and whether Lyudmila had ever fired her rifle in fear rather than duty. Another asked if soldiers flirted with her in the trenches. One woman leaned in conspiratorially. "Be honest, dear, isn't it terribly unfeminine to, shoot people?" Lyudmila set down her fork. The room went still for a heartbeat. "I shoot people who come to kill my country," she said. "Is that unfeminine?" This time the silence was not polite, it was startled. She began noticing a pattern. At events, she was placed slightly off stage until the exact moment she was needed. Organizers spoke about her in the third person while she stood beside them. They reminded her to keep answers cheerful, to avoid unpleasant numbers, to remember that American audiences scare easily. The cracks widened. In Detroit, when she asked for a translator to help her speak more precisely about the battles around Sevastopol, an organizer waved dismissively. "Details, Lyudmila? People don't want details. They want spirit." Spirit. She had seen spirits leave bodies in the dust of ruined stairwells. Each city magnified the same revelation. America liked her as a novelty, a curiosity, an emblem. They did not want Lyudmila Pavlichenko the sniper. They wanted Lyudmila Pavlichenko the story. And stories, she realized, were easier to decorate than truths. The cracks were no longer small. They were widening into a fracture line that would soon break completely open. The moment that broke the facade did not arrive with shouting or chaos. It arrived with perfect silence. Lyudmila Pavlichenko stood at a podium in Chicago, beneath a banner that read, "United Nations Rally for Victory." The auditorium held thousands, workers, students, veterans, curious families, faces bright beneath the stage lights, waiting for the exotic guest from the other side of the world. Behind her, the organizers shuffled nervously, each holding a copy of the speech they hoped she would deliver. It was a carefully constructed text, warm, hopeful, utterly bloodless. Lyudmila had read it once and handed it back without comment. As the applause faded, the presenter stepped aside. "Ladies and gentlemen," he declared, "the Soviet Union's own heroine, Lyudmila Pavlichenko." She walked forward with the calm certainty of someone who had crossed rubble under fire. She rested her hands on the wooden lectern. The lights were hot, almost blinding, but she saw the outlines of faces. Hundreds of them. Safe. Curious. Unscarred. A handler standing in the wings touched his throat with 2 fingers, the signal. Avoid combat details. Avoid numbers. Be inspiring. Lyudmila inhaled. She began in English, heavily accented but steady. "I thank you for your welcome," a murmur of approval. The handler smiled. "I stand before you," she continued, "as a soldier of the Soviet Union." The handler's smile froze. Lyudmila paused, letting the silence settle. She looked across the crowd and saw something familiar. Politeness mixed with ignorance. It reminded her of the new recruits she had trained before they saw their first corpse. She straightened. "Some of you ask me," she said slowly, "if I worry about my appearance, if I wear makeup in the trenches, if I think war is unfeminine." A ripple of embarrassment moved through the hall. "I will tell you," she said, "what I do in war." She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. "I'm 25 years old," Lyudmila Pavlichenko said, every syllable sharp as a rifle bolt locking into place. "And I have killed 309 fascist invaders." The hall stopped breathing. No cough, no murmur, no shifting of feet. It was as if the entire room had turned to stone. Lyudmila let the number hang in the air. 309. Not a metaphor, not a slogan, a fact. "I did not come here," she continued, "to be asked about my lipstick. I came here to tell you what is happening in my country." She leaned subtly forward. "In Odessa, our comrades were buried beneath rubble. In Sevastopol, The wounded lay in trenches filled with melting snow. Every day we lose fathers, mothers, children. You ask me what it is like to kill. I ask you what it is like to not be fighting. A shocked rustle swept the audience. Somewhere off stage, an organizer whispered, horrified, "She wasn't supposed to say any of this." But Lyudmila continued, calm, cold, factual. "I do not enjoy killing, but I am good at protecting my land. I shoot only those who come to destroy my home. 309 men came to do so. They did not leave." The room erupted, but not into applause. Into something stranger, awe mixed with fear. The crowd, confronted with reality, had no script to follow. The American newspapers had called her the pretty sniper, the girl with the rifle, the Soviet Joan of Arc. They had not been prepared for the actual woman who now stood before them. Lyudmila Pavlichenko had not just broken their expectations, she had broken the entire illusion. And as she stepped back from the podium, she understood something with sniper clarity. The Americans would try even harder now to reshape her. In the hours after the Chicago speech, the tone around Lyudmila Pavlichenko shifted. Not immediately, not publicly, but unmistakably. The applause had barely faded when the first organizer hurried toward her backstage, face tense, voice tight. "Lyudmila," he whispered, "we need to talk about the number." She looked at him calmly. 309? It is not secret. It's not about secrecy, he said, glancing around as if the walls themselves might judge him. It's about decorum. Americans aren't used to hearing things like that. Lyudmila blinked once. Then Americans are not used to war. It was not sarcasm. It was an observation sharpened by experience. But the organizer recoiled as if she had slapped him with the truth. The next morning, she met with a panel of advisors assigned to manage her appearances. They spoke with forced politeness, their voices soft, their sentences padded with euphemisms. One man, smoothing his tie compulsively, tried to explain that American audiences needed hopeful narratives. Another said that mentioning kills made listeners uncomfortable. A woman insisted that Americans wanted inspiration, not brutality. Lyudmila listened, silent, her hands folded neatly on the table. When they finished, she said, "You invited a sniper. What did you expect me to talk about? Ballet?" The advisors exchanged looks of helpless frustration. Later, at another event, she overheard two PR staffers arguing quietly near a row of microphones. "We can't let her speak freely," one hissed. "She's too direct." "She's scaring people. She's Soviet, what did you expect?" "She needs to stick to the script." The phrase "stick to the script" struck her harder than any mortar blast ever had. It captured everything she had sensed since her arrival. America was not afraid of her violence. They were afraid of her honesty. Over the next days, attempts to soften her image intensified. Every interview came with recommended talking points. Every speech draft had lines crossed out and phrases rewritten. She was told to avoid describing battlefield conditions, to refrain from mentioning dead comrades, to steer clear of numbers larger than a few dozen. She ignored most of it. At a private luncheon with donors in Cleveland, an elderly man leaned across the table, smiling kindly but condescendingly. "My dear," he said, "our women are delicate creatures. They faint at the sight of a spider. How do you manage all that unpleasant business?" Lyudmila cut a piece of bread with methodical precision. "In my country," she said, "women faint only after the battle is over." The man choked on his wine. In another city, a radio host asked her to describe her favorite peacetime hobbies, clearly hoping to steer the discussion into harmless domesticity. Lyudmila answered truthfully, "Reading military history." The host laughed, assuming she was joking. She wasn't, but it was in a small green room in Philadelphia, where the pressure finally reached its limit. Moments before a live appearance, a young assistant took her aside. He was sweating, anxious, clutching a cue card with trembling fingers. "Please, Miss Pavlichenko," he said. "No numbers today, no talk of killing. Just stick to the inspiring parts. The audience is sensitive." Lyudmila looked at the curtain separating her from the stage. Another curtain, Another attempt to control her, and something in her snapped into perfect alignment. She leaned close enough for him to hear the steel in her voice. "You're hiding me behind curtains," she said. The assistant froze. The words were not loud, but they carried a kind of quiet devastation that only someone who had survived cities turned to ash could deliver. Lyudmila stepped back, her expression neutral, her shoulders squared like a soldier preparing to move into open ground. Behind the curtain, her name was being announced again, wrapped in polite American admiration. But Lyudmila Pavlichenko had already decided she would not be edited. She would not be softened. She would not be rewritten into something safe. And beyond that curtain, the conflict between truth and theater was about to become impossible to ignore. Aviso. Young woman in WWE military uniform, short wavy hair, sharp eyes, calm focused expression, lying prone in tall grass with a scoped rifle, in the weeks after her quiet explosion. You re-hiding me behind curtains. The American tour of Lyudmila Pavlichenko began to fray like an overstretched uniform seam. Nothing collapsed all at once. It happened the way buildings fail under artillery. First the tremors, then the cracks, then the sudden realization that the structure was never strong enough to endure the truth. The first tremor came from the newspapers. Just days earlier, they had printed gentle, ornamental headlines. Pretty Soviet sniper visits the US. Girl warrior charms Chicago. Now the tone shifted. Not hostile, not reverent, something sharper. 309 kills, the number that stunned America. Soviet markswoman speaks with terrifying clarity. Pictures of Lyudmila Pavlichenko began appearing not beside society pages, but in sections usually reserved for war correspondents. Editors discovered what the PR teams had tried to bury. Americans were fascinated by people who could describe war without flinching. Crowds grew, not because she was being softened, but because she refused to be. At a rally in Pittsburgh, thousands pressed shoulder to shoulder, filling the auditorium, spilling into the street. They expected something dramatic. They got something better. Pavlichenko standing straight, hands steady, voice level, describing the front with a plainness that cut deeper than sensationalism. She told them about the smell of burning oil, about nights spent waiting in ruined stairwells, about the way German helmets caught the light before a shot. An American veteran approached her afterward. His hand shook as he saluted. "You said what nobody here wants to hear," he muttered. "Thank you." But not everyone welcomed her honesty. Behind the scenes, Soviet handlers grew increasingly agitated. They had expected a polished propaganda success, not a geopolitical firestorm. They wanted controlled messaging, carefully curated sympathy, predictable applause. Instead, Pavlichenko was creating unpredictable ripples. Every unscripted sentence she spoke was reproduced in newspapers before they could intercept it. One Soviet official confronted her in a hotel corridor, lowering his voice. "Comrade Pavlichenko, you must remember that you represent the Union. You are to follow instructions." "I follow truth," she said. "That is not always the same thing," he replied. In Boston, American organizers tried a new tactic. More glamour. They placed her in front of ornate backdrops, arranged banquets, introduced her to celebrities whose eyes widened uncomfortably when she mentioned the siege of Sevastopol. One Hollywood actress asked if Pavlichenko ever grew emotional after shooting someone. Lyudmila's reply was simple. "No, I grew emotional when my friends were killed." The actress had no script prepared for that. Tension thickened like smoke. PR managers whispered urgently behind curtains. Soviet diplomats sent frantic cables back to Moscow. American officials debated whether her public candor was helpful or inflammatory. But each attempt to steer her only exposed how uncontrollable she truly was. And the Americans discovered something unexpected. The public respected her bluntness. Her speeches raised morale more effectively than any polished propaganda. People in factory lines clipped her quotes to bulletin boards. Soldiers in training repeated her words in barracks. "You ask me what it's like to kill? I ask you what it's like to not be fighting." The tour had begun as a diplomatic performance. Now it was spreading like wildfire, unmanaged, unfiltered, raw. But for Lyudmila Pavlichenko, the change carried a quiet cost. Every time she spoke honestly, she drifted further from the roles others had written for her. further from the Soviet ideal of a controlled icon, further from the American desire for decoration. Her truth was useful only when it served someone else's narrative. Once it spilled outside those boundaries, it became a threat, and as the tour continued, she realized a new kind of battle had begun. Not against soldiers with rifles, but against nations with agendas. A battle where every word was ammunition. A battle she had not asked for, but one she would finish with the same precision she carried into the ruins of Sevastopol. By the time Lyudmila Pavlichenko completed her final speeches in the United States, she had become two different people in two different countries, neither of which resembled the woman she actually was. To the Americans, she was now a legend carved out of awe and discomfort. The girl who killed 309 men. The woman who spoke bluntly about death. The soldier who refused to be softened. To the Soviets, she had become something more complicated and far less convenient. A hero, yes, but also a variable. A figure who could speak truth too freely, too clearly, too publicly. A weapon that could not be holstered. When she returned to the Soviet Union, the welcome felt strangely muted. She was greeted officially, photographed, praised, but there was a stiffness in the air, a formality that lacked warmth. Her commanders shook her hand with polished enthusiasm, yet avoided discussing her desire to return to the front. They congratulated her on representing the motherland abroad, but quickly shifted the conversation to her continued usefulness in training roles. Lyudmila wasted no time. "I am ready to rejoin my unit," she said. "Send me back to the front." Her superior, a colonel with medals that gleamed like hard winter frost, looked down at his papers. "Comrade Pavlichenko, you have already served the Union with exceptional distinction." She understood the subtext immediately. They did not want her back at the front. Not because she lacked skill, she was one of the deadliest snipers alive. But because she had become too valuable as an image, too fragile as a symbol, too exposed after the American tour, and perhaps too unpredictable. "You will serve as an instructor," the colonel continued. "Your experience will save many lives." "Save lives? Yes, but from a distance, through others. Through lectures and drills, not through her own hands and rifle, positioned in cold rubble." That night, alone in her barracks, Lyudmila Pavlichenko set her Mosin Nagant rifle on the bunk beside her. She ran her thumb along the worn wood of the stock. Every scratch had history, every dent had meaning. For months the weapon had been her voice, her will, her anchor. Now it was merely a relic she was not permitted to use. In the following weeks, she trained young recruits, boys barely out of school, girls who had volunteered despite trembling hands. They listened to her with reverence. They memorized her instructions. But each lesson reminded her of what she could no longer do herself. Her body bore the scars of battle. Her mind bore the weight of survival. Her reputation, however, bore the burden of politics. Rumors drifted through the hallways that Moscow wanted to protect her from the risk of death, that her value as a living symbol outweighed any tactical advantage she might provide on the battlefield. Others whispered that the hierarchy had become too outspoken during her tour, too difficult to control. Were even whispers, never confirmed, that the Americans had asked if she could return for additional engagements. Moscow refused. Heroes were easier to maintain when they remained still. As the war dragged on, Lyudmila's presence faded from foreign headlines. New offensives captured attention. New atrocities overshadowed old stories. Her name, so electrifying on American posters, was replaced by the names of battles, factories, generals. The world moved forward at a pace only war could command. But Lyudmila Pavlichenko did not disappear. She simply slipped into a quieter role, training others to survive the same violence she had endured, watching them march off to battles she was forbidden to fight. Instructors are remembered by their students. Snipers are remembered by their numbers. Symbols are remembered only when convenient. And Lyudmila was discovering, slowly, painfully, that the truth she had spoken so boldly in America had a price. She had been transformed into something untouchable, too visible to risk, too valuable to deploy, too real to glorify, too dangerous to unleash. A hero, yes, but a hero locked behind curtains of a different kind. Years later, long after the applause had faded and the newspapers had yellowed, Lyudmila Pavlichenko would remember America not by the parades or the banquets, but by the curtains. They were always there, thin fabric separating her from the stage, from the crowds, from the version of herself that others wanted to display. She realized, in time, that the curtains had never been about her. They were about protection, not of her, but of the audience. Curtains keep light controlled, shadows softened, truth filtered. War, however, does not respect fabric. In the quiet that followed her withdrawal from frontline combat, Lyudmila often replayed the tour in her mind. The journalists asking about lipstick, the photographers adjusting her posture, the advisors warning her not to overwhelm the public, the Soviet officials monitoring her every word, the American hosts urging her to avoid unpleasant numbers. She had crossed continents to tell the truth, and both nations, each in different ways, had tried to place her within borders she did not fit. And yet it was that very truth, spoken without hesitation, that changed the narrative. In the United States, manufacturing output surged after her visit. Workers quoted her in factories as motivation. Local newspapers recorded lines from her speeches that cut deeper than any propaganda slogan. I ask you what it is like to not be fighting. Her presence stripped away illusions about distant battlefields. She forced Americans to acknowledge a world beyond their insulated shores. In the Soviet Union, her name became a line in textbooks, a footnote in lectures about heroism. Children memorized her number, 309, without ever learning the context behind each shot. She became a monument, carved into something solid and unchanging, despite being a human being shaped by trauma, precision, and will. She understood the paradox. Nations do not celebrate individuals. They sculpt them. Truth becomes statue. Statue becomes message. Late one evening, years after the war, Lyudmila visited a veterans' hospital where former comrades rested in dimly lit rooms. Many recognized her immediately. Some saluted. Others simply nodded. A nurse placed a weathered copy of a wartime American newspaper in her hands. On the front page was a photograph from her Chicago speech. Her face lit by stage lamps, jaw set with that familiar sniper calm. The caption read, 309 kills the sniper who shocked America. She studied the image. It captured her posture, her expression, her resolve. But it captured nothing of the exhaustion behind her eyes, or the price she had paid to survive long enough to reach that podium. Truth, she realized, is too large to fit inside photographs, too heavy to be carried by headlines, to be filtered through propaganda, But she had spoken it, and the world had listened, even if only for a moment. As she left the hospital, the autumn wind tugged at her coat. For a brief instant, the sound of rustling fabric reminded her of those thin curtains in Washington, the ones meant to conceal her, to tame her, to shape her. Back then, she had stepped through them without hesitation. Now, decades later, she understood the full meaning of that act. Curtains can delay truth, they can soften it, frame it, dress it in palatable colors, but they cannot stop it. Truth passes through fabric the way a bullet passes through air. Unimpressed, uninterested, unbound. And so the final lesson of Lyudmila Pavlichenko, sniper, soldier, survivor, was not about warfare or marksmanship or courage. It was about the fragility of illusions. Nations can build narratives, generals can polish symbols, journalists can decorate stories, but arithmetic does not care. Reality does not bend, and war does not hide politely behind curtains. In the end, her legacy was simple, dry, undeniable. The truth was never dangerous because of what it revealed. It was dangerous because it refused to stay hidden.